African Slave Trade by Kendall, Cami, and Mahina. The trans-African slave trade began around the mid-15th century when Portuguese interests in Africa moved away from the fabled deposit of gold to a much more readily available commodities, slaves. How was it maintained? Between 1450 and 1850, about 12 million Africans were shipped to the plantations of America. Perhaps as many as 4 million more Africans were killed in slaving wars prior to the shipment. The volume of slaves shipped increased from the 16th century to the 18th century. By 1800s, about 3 million slaves resided in America. At its end in the 19th century, the slave trade still shipped more than 1 million slaves to Cuba and Brazil. High slave mortality in the plantation environment required the constant replenishment of workers. Only in the southern United States were there positive population growth among the slave population. Until 1630, the slave trade remained in the hands of the Portuguese. The Dutch and the British began to export slaves to plantation colonies in America after 1637. France did not become a major slave exporter until the 18th century. Europeans sent to coastal forts to manage the slave trade suffered extraordinary mortality rates from tropical disease. It ended after the Haitian Revolution. The concept of having slaves became a fear of further rebellions, so they wanted to keep the slave numbers below the white numbers. Thus, the opposition against it in the European nations involved grew. Britain banned the Atlantic slave trade in 1807. As they owned the world seas, they would fine anyone caught shipping slaves.
Those who participated or those who were victimized were black men, women, and children. All of them participated unwillingly, often sold to the Europeans by other African groups that would kidnap them. This affected them because it took away their freedom and sent them into a harsh environment in which they lived in fear and endless work and had no control over their own rights and decisions. Adult male slaves would be forced to work in pastures, fields, and gardens. Usually their master would ride around on a horse and with a whip, threatening to punish anyone who he saw slacking off. Women and children were forced to do domestic work such as cooking and cleaning. As punishment, these women and children would be whipped, starved, or raped. How and why did European nations colonize Africa? Between the 1870s and the 1900s, Africa faced European imperialist aggression, diplomatic pressures, military invasions, and eventual conquest and colonization. The Europeans wanted the jewels, gold, oil, and other things that would bring them lots of money. They took all of the resources. There was a scramble for Africa in which lots of countries sought to take over Africa. The Europeans also saw it as whoever got Africa was like the better country. The European imperialist push into Africa was motivated by three main factors: economic, political, and social. It developed in the 19th century following the collapse of profitability in the slave trade. Its abolition and suppression, as well as the expansion of European capitalist industrial revolution.
Because of colonialism in Africa, many of its people have suffered vast genocide and one of the worst holocausts in the world. This induced the massive loss of African population and knowledge as well as culture. Through the Berlin Treaty of 26 February 1885, the European imperialists sliced Africa into Portuguese Africa, British Africa, German Africa, Italian Africa, Spanish Africa, French Africa, and Belgian Africa. Many atrocities were committed towards the African people on the land claimed by the European countries. In some areas, if work was not completed thoroughly enough, the women of the tribe would be taken and kept as hostages.
What the transition was like from colonialism to independence in Africa. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan country to achieve independence from European colonial rule. Over the next 23 years, most of the other sub-Saharan colonies followed suit. Expectations on the continuant
Mahina,
and
so
around
loud.
that would be
Okay, go.
around the world were high as leaders hoped that sub-Saharan African states would take off both politically and economically to become viable. Independent actors around in the world community. However, most of the independent African states struggled almost immediately under the weight of protracted political and economic crisis. Africa's first wave of democratization quickly morphed into a wave of apostasy as African military seized power in the mid-1960s and multi-party systems gave way to one-party regiments. Economic stagnation had set in the early 1980s and African states became increasingly dependent on international development assistance, thereby incurring enormous debts. Then after the end of the Cold War, Western powers began to make their aid to Africa continual on the pursuit of good governance and democratization. In the early 1990s, Africa entered a second wave of democratization as autocratic regimes gave way to new, more democratic constitutions and multi-party systems.
In modern-day Africa, big corporations exploit the land, seeing Africa as more of a cash grabber or a gold pot instead of actually a continent with people. Due to Western imperialism, rich corporations of the Western world gain more as the people of Africa gain less. According to Emerald Wood, who is the director of foreign affairs for the Washington, D.C. based Institute for Policy Studies, the corporations use labor and land, and the people doing the labor have to pay the price instead of the higher ups. This is pretty much like modern day slavery.